All right, today we are diving into a piece of legislation with a name that, it sounds almost friendly, but its impact was absolutely massive. We're talking about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBBA. This thing really kicked off one of the biggest shifts in federal spending we've seen in a long time. So let's get into what it did and why it's such a big deal. So, what was this bill really all about? Well, the source material doesn't mince words. It says the act was specifically designed to, and I quote, slash funding for social, health, and environmental programs. And on top of that, to weaken the very agencies that regulate them. That single goal right there pretty much sets the stage for everything we're about to cover. So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll get a handle on what the OBB actually is. Then, we'll walk through its impact on financial regulators, the social safety net, and a whole host of green initiatives. And you're going to want to stick around for the end, because there's this fascinating legislative twist, the story of the cuts that didn't make it into the final law. So at its very core, the OBBBA was a blueprint for deep, widespread funding cuts. I mean, you can really think of it as a fundamental rerouting of federal money, taking it away from programs that deal with consumer protection, public health, and environmental policy. Okay, so the first major area to feel the heat was financial regulation. And look, this went way beyond just trimming budgets. The act actually put specific legal changes in place, all aimed at reducing the power of some key financial watchdogs. First up was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. Its funding got slashed by nearly half. Now, to really get what that means, you have to remember what the CFPB does. This is the agency that goes after things like predatory lending and unfair bank fees. According to the source, this is the same agency that had already gotten over $21 billion back into consumers' pockets. And the way they did this was just so direct. The law literally went into the act that created the CFPB, found the number 12 in its funding cap, and just replaced it with 6.5. I mean, there's no ambiguity there. It was a direct cut to the agency's financial lifeline. But it didn't stop there. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, also got a major shakeup. Its reserve fund is now scheduled to be closed down. And all the money that's currently in it, it doesn't matter if it's already been set aside for something, it's all going to be transferred right back into the Treasury's main pot. All right, so from financial regulation, we pivot to what is maybe the biggest area of cuts in the whole bill. The social safety net. This is where the OMBB made just these massive reductions to programs that millions and millions of Americans count on for things like healthcare and food. And the scale here is just wow. It was truly historic. When it comes to Medicaid, that's the federal health insurance program for low-income folks, these were the single largest funding cuts in the entire history of the program. And the number itself is just staggering. We're talking about over $900 billion in projected cuts to federal Medicaid funding. That's a 12% cut overall. And get this, the Congressional Budget Office projected that states would probably have to scramble to cover about half of that shortfall themselves. The Food Assistance Program, SNAP, also took a major hit. And the cuts came from two different directions. First, a $186 billion cut to federal nutrition funding over the next decade. But then, on top of that, a 50% cut to the federal money that helps states actually run the program, which could make it much harder for them to get the benefits out. Beyond those huge programs, there are some other really targeted changes. The act brought in a rule that restricts federal Medicaid funds for 1 year from going to what it calls prohibited entities, which was defined to include organizations like Planned Parenthood. It also just completely repealed a grant program for nutrition education and obesity prevention. Just gone. The OBBBA's reach didn't stop at social programs, though. It extended deep into the environmental world. Here, the act pretty much systematically dismantled funding for a whole bunch of clean energy initiatives. And a lot of these were programs that were just set up under the previous Inflation Reduction Act. And the scope of these environmental cuts was just enormous. The law didn't just trim, it outright repealed the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. It also rescinded, which basically means it took back, money that was already approved for this huge list of programs. We're talking funding for NOAA, clean vehicles, air pollution programs, green housing retrofits, methane reduction, you name it. The impact was felt pretty much across the board in federal environmental policy. Now, this is fascinating. This was a change in the rules, not just the funding. Before, automakers had to pay a penalty if their cars didn't meet certain fuel economy standards. Well, the OBBBA changed that penalty to 0. It just completely removed the financial reason for automakers to build more fuel-efficient cars. Okay, so before we get to our last section, we need a quick lesson on how Washington works. We got to talk about something called the Byrd Rule. Now, in simple terms, this is a Senate rule that says you can't just stuff a bunch of non-budget stuff into a special kind of bill called a reconciliation bill. Everything in that bill has to be first and foremost about the budget, and this is going to be super important for what's coming next. And that brings us to our final and I think most interesting section, the cuts that were supposed to happen but didn't. This gives us a really fascinating peek behind the curtain at what the bill's authors originally wanted to do before it got trimmed down to follow the Senate's rules. So because of that Byrd Rule, the Senate parliamentarian, who's kind of like the referee, ended up stripping several big items out of the bill. This included a $1.4 billion pay cut for Federal Reserve staff, a nearly $300 million cut to the Office of Financial Research, and even the complete elimination of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. They were all removed because they were seen as not being primarily about the budget. So when you step back and look at the big picture, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act kicked off this huge rerouting of federal money, steering it away from social programs, environmental work, and regulatory agencies. These are sweeping, historic changes, and they leave us with a really fundamental question. What are the long-term consequences when you make a shift this big in our national priorities?